Hi, good morning. Uh, Today we'll be discussing about economic development and economic growth, which is the broad topic for our fourth module under the course Economic Growth and Development. So basically, today we'll be discussing about broad overviews of economic development models. Okay, so before this, we have already discussed about various growth theories, starting from Harad-Domar growth model, then neoclassical growth model, and endogenous growth models. So basically, what we learned is basically accumulation of capital, population growth, high saving rate, and technological progress. These are the factors which drive economic growth, and of course, the endogenous growth theories suggested, the lab equipment model or product varieties model or Schumpeterian models, Dixit, Stiglitz model, all these knowledge spillover model, all these models which we discussed basically suggest how in an economy there are some inherent features in the industrial organization. Guided by the profit motive, there will be an incentive for the producer to undertake innovation. So these drive to innovate for making profit is part of the production or the industrial organization. So it is endogenous to the behavior of the farm. Now, what is the difference between economic development and economic growth, or how they are related? So if you are looking at the cross-country economic position today, we have some countries which are part of OECD countries club. These are basically rich countries. Say you take United States, you take Switzerland, you take Luxembourg, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. So these are the countries where per capita income is very high. Okay, and we term these countries as developed countries. Okay, with per capita income very high. And there are other countries which are mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where per capita income is very low. We call them the poor countries. Now, if you look at the past economic performance between the two countries, the developed countries of today, their economic growth have been sustained over last 200 years or so. So basically, because they were able to sustain economic growth for such a long period, so they are the developed countries today. And the economies of the poor, so-called poor countries, have been largely stagnant for large part of their history. So they are the poor countries. So here, when we are talking about economic development, perhaps what we mean is per capita income is high. There is a very high degree of industrialization, urbanization. Say per capita consumption, per capita capital is high. On the contrary, if you look at the features of the underdeveloped countries or the poor countries, their per capita consumption, per capita income will be low, and largely dominated by the primary sector. So large part of their consumption basket consists of the food articles, high degree of illiteracy. In terms of demography, maybe high mortality rate, and because of high degree of illiteracy, so the quality of human capital is low. Savings and capital formation is not up to mark. So that is broadly the difference between the developed countries and the poor or underdeveloped countries. Now, as I said, the developed countries could attain this status because they were able to sustain growth for such a long period of time. Uh, the growth theories which we discussed in our course, mostly try to explain the basically the pattern of growth in these advanced economies. Basically, what we discuss, particularly in the neoclassical growth, there have been a transition state where, with accumulation, with increase of per capita capital, the per capita growth gradually increases, given depreciation, population growth, and then there is a point at which the per capita capital stops growing. We call it the steady state. So at that level, the per capita income also stops growing. This is in the solo basic model. But of course, even in this model, although per capita capital and per capita income become stagnant, stationary, but income, GDP and capital keeps on growing. The growth rate of output, GDP, income and capital, even at stationary state, is positive, which is basically equal to the growth rate of population n. That is what we discussed. But then the solo model with technological progress and following endogenous model taught us basically how even the per capita capital, per capita output can witness sustained growth over a longer period of time, right? And we basically, these models we discussed about the balanced growth path, where consumption, growth, GDP output grows at a constant rate, and per capita capital also grows, but maybe the growth rate of capital is different. But there has been a balanced growth path for these variables, based on different models. These balanced growth path, BGP, this is a feature of today's matured economies, okay, the developed economies. But the story of developing economies were little different. So it was observed long before that these economies have become stagnant. They are not growing as basically suggested by the growth models. So there have been many ideas to try to understand why these economies were stagnant and how to break it. Okay, so the broad overview of growth theories which will suggest will basically discuss this part, not the stories of the advanced economies today, but the stories of these poor economies, their characteristic features, their institutions, their socio-political economic infrastructure, which basically compel some sort of restricted these economies to grow and which were stagnant. So if you were talking in terms of literature, the literature of on economic growth have been very extensive. The works have been both at the theoretical end as well as empirical work has been conducted. Large number of literature is available. If you look at the research on development, basically the research on development is largely non-theoretical. Despite being non-theoretical, the insight and the ideas which come from the literature is quite useful. They basically talk about certain important economic relations in developing economies. So broadly, if we can divide these two, I think we can apply growth theories once economy attains a certain level of maturity, which is applicable to the developed and advanced economies, and the theories of development, economic development, are applicable to those economies which are at the initial level of economic progress. Now, under theories of development or broad ideas on economic development, what we'll discuss, first we'll start with vicious circle of poverty, which basically suggests that there are some constellation of forces which work in such a manner that the economy remains stagnant. It doesn't grow. Okay, the economy remains to be poor. As I told earlier, the characteristic feature of the poor or underdeveloped economies is their predominance of agriculture in terms of composition of output, large workforce in agriculture. Consumption basket largely consists of food articles, and mass unemployment, mass poverty and chronic and disguised unemployment is quite vast. So, the vicious circle of poverty we can basically explain in terms of two circles. One, we can have perhaps you can have some structure like this, where it is economic underdevelopment, and this economic underdevelopment had two features. So first one on the top, we can discuss about lack of industrialization. Okay, so the lack of industrialization in these economies, which is again same as telling that predominantly the primary sector dominates the output. So large, the vast population, the vast workforce is engaged in form of underemployment, disguised employment, etc. in the primary sector. So basically the primary sector is overcrowded. So given that the primary sector is overcrowded, the productivity in primary sector is low, and because of that the surplus which is generated in agriculture sector is low, and that basically restricts the generation of demand for the industrial goods. Okay, so this works like a vicious circle. So lack of industrialization, which implies predominance of primary sector, primary sector is overcrowded, so the productivity in the primary sector is low, and that leads to generation of very little surplus in agriculture sector. So automatically there is no demand for agricultural goods, and the lack of industrialization continues. This we can see from demand side. If I are looking at supply side, the economic underdevelopment is also characterized by, as we said, low per capita income. So when there is low per capita income, naturally the saving will be low, because as we understand, if you apply Keynesian marginal propensity to consume, the marginal propensity to consume is generally found to be very high at low spectrum of income level. So given that there is low per capita income, the savings were low. Once saving is low, then capital formation is low. So naturally there is less capital available to the worker in the industry, and then with the low productivity in industry, and the it leads to low per capita income. So then there is another circle which is working from supply side. So basically the problem of the poor countries or underdeveloped countries is they are stuck in this vicious circle of poverty. Basically this perpetuates, their poverty perpetuates, given the demand side and supply side factors as I explained. So the growth theories doesn't give a solution to this, right? So many ideas emerged. Basically first I'll take up a set of ideas where people suggested how to break this vicious circle of poverty. Basically we'll discuss ideas by three eminent economists. One is Rosenstern-Roden, and then Professor Harvey Levinstein, and then Rostow. Basically these economists suggested three ways how we can break this vicious circle of poverty. Of course the idea is similar, that's why I'm quoting these three. First one, let us take the idea of big push theory by Professor Rosenstern-Roden. What this theory suggests that the amount of investment, amount of capital formation which is required to break this vicious cycle poverty is huge. Basically what he suggests, if the amount of investment is so high so that there is enough externality created which will basically encourage industrial production in other sectors, both from demand side and supply side pool, then only this vicious circle of poverty can be broken. For example, what he suggested is perhaps there is high level of externality in social overhead capital. Basically, if there is appropriate investment in sectors like physical infrastructure like road, railways, airport, water supply, communication, okay, education, health, if there is adequate expenditure, investment in this social overhead capital, then this will perhaps generate the required externalities which will encourage growth of other industrial sectors. Okay. Now, the idea was, these social overhead capital is indivisible. Okay. So, the amount of investment which is required is huge, because the lumpiness and indivisibility of the social overhead capital. So one cannot adopt a bit by bit or gradualism approach. Rather, there has to be a huge amount of investment in social overhead capital, given its lumpiness and indivisibility characteristic, so that that will act as an positive externality for other sectors to grow. Similar ideas was propounded by Professor Harvey Levinson, and his theory is known as critical minimum effort thesis. So what this critical minimum effort thesis suggests is these poor economies are stuck at a lower income equilibrium, this vicious of circular poverty. So if you are doing or putting little effort, small effort in a bit by bit and a gradualism approach, incrementalism approach, then that will not be enough to break this lower level of equilibrium, income equilibrium. Okay. So there is a need of huge amount of investment which will create enough income generating impact, overcoming the income dampening impact, so that the economy can break this lower income equilibrium and it can move to a higher income equilibrium, right? So his idea is in terms of ensuring that some minimum critical amount of effort is required in terms of investment and expenditure, so that the economy can break the lower income equilibrium. Now there is a very popular theory by W. Rostow, which is basically explains the stages of growth for various economies, going by the history of economic progress of many economies. What Professor Rostow has done, he tried to basically decompose this entire history of these countries into various stages. His theory is also known as the takeoff into self-sustained growth. So basically, he has put the entire historical experience of economic progress of various countries into 5 stages. The first stage is traditional society, second stage is pre-conditions for takeoff, third stage is takeoff, and then fourth stage is drive to maturity, and fifth stage is age of high mass consumption. But many economists try to condense these 5 stages of growth to broadly 3 stages of growth. Basically, first two, that is traditional society and preconditions for takeoff, these put as the first stage when people put into total 3 stages. So this first stage is preconditions for growth, then takeoff, and the third stage is stage for sustained self-sustained growth. Okay. So what I'm trying to tell you, the Rostow's 5 stages is condensed to 3 broad stages. First two is preconditions for takeoff. Second is takeoff, and then third is stage of self-sustained growth. So in all the three stages, Rostow has given significant importance to the takeoff stage. That is thought to be most critical. Basically, these idea is explained using the analogy of a flight. So when a aircraft before takeoff, it runs on the runway. So it has to basically achieve a particular speed threshold. After achieving a particular high level of speed, okay, then beyond that threshold, then the flight can take off. Okay, that the takeoff stage is very critical, and after flying, for certain time in that takeoff phase, then it achieves the very high level of altitude, where then that equilibrium flight path is maintained at a very high level of height. So similarly, this takeoff phase is very important, very critical according to Rostow. And if an economy can achieve some minimum investment, then it can reach the takeoff stage. What basically Rostow has identified in takeoff stage, generally there is a rapid growth in capital formation, and during the takeoff phase, one or two manufacturing sectors generally witness very high growth, which act as the leading sector. And along with these two, there is a third characteristic which he had observed, is there have been some conducive political, economic and institutional framework which comes up, which support these leading sectors. And with this, the economy attains the self-sustained growth path. So basically, the takeoff phase for various economies, as Rostow has found out, it lasts for roughly a couple of decades. I think for various economies, Rostow has found different periods. Like for Great Britain, Rostow found 1783 to 1802 as the period of takeoff. For United States, this period is 1843 to 1860. For Germany, it was 1850 to 1873. For Japan, 1878 to 1900. For Canada, 1896 to 1914. So basically, these are the periods of takeoff which extended for roughly a couple of decades, where this significant transition took place in terms of achieving very high rate of capital formation, a couple of manufacturing sector becoming the leading sector of the economy, driving the other sectors along with that, and then of course a conducive social, political and institutional infrastructure being set up which supports this process leading to the self-sustained path. And one important feature which associated with this theory is basically in the takeoff phase, even in the pre-conditions of takeoff phase, the emphasis is on production. Once self-sustained phase is attained, then emphasis shifts from production to consumption and economic welfare. Now these are the various ideas in terms of big push theory, or in terms of critical minimum effort, or in terms of takeoff, which Rostow has suggested. They basically give there is one common thread in all these, that the gradualism or incrementalism or piecemeal approach will not help. There has to be significant effort in terms of big push, in terms of minimum critical effort, or in terms of rise in investment, capital formation for takeoff, which is critical for breaking the vicious circle of poverty. Then the ideas on development we can basically divide into two, in terms of balanced growth and unbalanced growth. There are some economists, basically Ragnar Knox, Rosenstein, Roden and Lewis, W. Lewis. Their ideas we can basically put in terms of balanced growth. And there are another set of economists, A.W. Hirschman, A.O. Hirschman, Professor Hans Singer and Professor Paul Streetin, whose ideas we can put in terms of unbalanced growth. What is the distinction between balanced and unbalanced growth? Basically, the ideas for balanced growth is the various sectors, the efforts for investment and capital formation should be such that there is a synchronized growth in various sectors of the economy. Say, for example, the example given by, I think, Rosenstein Roden is about the shoe industry. If the economy invests all its resources in shoe industry, perhaps shoe production will expand, employment in shoe industry will expand, but then the wage income which is generated because of exclusive investment in shoe industry will be used only partially for buying the shoes, and then with a lack of demand, the shoe industry cannot sustain itself. So rather, if the investment happens in a coordinated manner, in a synchronized manner, in all those sectors which have complementarity in terms of mass consumption, then perhaps the income generated across the sectors can be spent on products produced across the sectors, and then this will able to sustain the growth. Okay, so the same idea can apply to production in agriculture vis-a-vis production in industry, production for home compared to production for exports. So the idea is there has to be balanced investment in across the sectors, so that the complementarity between them is exploited, and then economy can grow in a sustained manner. However, the major drawback of these ideas, which basically pointed out by the proponents of unbalanced growth theories, is the problem of the poor countries or underdeveloped countries is they do not have enough capital, they do not have enough resources. So when there is a scarcity of resource, scarcity of capital, how to undertake synchronized investment across all the industries? Okay, so there is a practical handicap there. So what they suggest, instead of this plan of spending in across the sectors, it is better to identify certain sectors which have very strong forward and backward linkages. Okay, so basically we'll say forward linkage if take industry A. So if industry A's output is used as input in the industry B, so then growth of industry A may support growth of industry B. So this is forward linkage. Backward linkage, when industry A uses output of industry C as input. This is backward linkage. So output of industry C used as input in industry A, this is backward linkage. Forward linkage, output of industry A is used as input in industry B is forward linkage. So the idea of unbalanced growth theories is basically we need to identify those sectors which have high level of forward and backward linkages. Basically the idea is the social overhead capital. If your investment in these sectors, or say for example iron and steel industry, this may have very strong forward and backward linkages. Social overhead capital, this has very strong forward and backward linkages. So if investment is made in these sectors, okay, then gradually they will help in pulling other sectors along, and over time you can achieve high level of growth in a sustained manner. And Professor Gedelmayer, he tried to some sort of balance these differences between the proponents of the balanced theory and unbalanced theory of development or growth. I'll quote him to quote, while a newly developing country should aim at balance as an investment criteria, this objective will be attained only by initially following, in most cases, a policy of unbalanced investment. In operational terms, the crucial question has become how to determine what is the proper sequence of investment decisions in order to create the right amount of imbalance in right activities. Okay, so I think both ideas are important, Maybe one had to start with the unbalanced approach where there is heavy investment in social overhead capital, or industries where there is strong linkages both backward and forward. And then beyond a point, one can move to balanced growth with accumulation of adequate capital and capability to invest. Now let us move from here. Basically, we have two sets of ideas when we are discussing the history of economic progress of the countries. The economic growth theories, they some sort of explain the features or the characters of economic progress in mature economies, where we can think of with with technological progress, how one can sustain the the self-perpetuating balanced growth path, and the conditions before this, particularly at initial level of economic progress, the things are different, where due to lack of capital formation, lack of quality manpower, and various features of the poor economies which we discussed, has to be addressed so that the vicious circle of poverty can be broken and one can move forward. Unfortunately, we don't have a unified theoretical framework in which we can deal this both the problems at one place. So what is done is basically these two issues are addressed separately. Basically, in this framework, one can think of economic growth, which focuses on balanced growth, the growth process approximating the behavior of relatively developed economies, and the theories of ideas on economic development, which basically focus on the transformation, structural changes and transformation, and related efficiency implications at early stage of economic development. Acemoglu 2009, the reference which, by the way, I'll be using two references for this module on economic growth and development. This is the first one, Modern Economic Growth by Daron Acemoglu, and for some part of today's discussion, I have used Principle of Macroeconomics by Rangarajan and Dholakia. So for rest part of the discussion on economic growth and development, which will take up, I'll be only confining myself to the book by Daron Acemoglu. So basically, what he tries to some sort of use the standard framework which has been used in growth theories. There is a representative consumer household, infinite living household. There is a farm, and from their behavior, using general equilibrium framework, he has tried to explain how these structural transformation and structural change occur. Basically, using both the demand side and supply side factor, he is trying to explain how the workforce and production share of changes from the primary sector to the secondary sector, like from agriculture to industry, and how the productivity of one sector like industry sector is higher compared to the agriculture sector. So using the similar framework which we have discussed until now for endogenous growth theories, he tries to explain the process of economic development in terms of the structural change and structural transformation, which will be very interesting, and we'll take up that for the future lectures. So if you have any doubts, you please get back to me, and yes, all the best. Thank you.